The hour before dawn was when the Colosseum breathed differently, when the stone still held the cold of night, and the sand in the arena above bore the ghost weight of yesterday's dead. And Marcus Decius moved through the maintenance corridors beneath the amphitheater with the particular alertness of a man who understood that survival meant noticing what others ignored. The way a certain door's hinges had rusted silent, the section of wall where the mortar had crumbled enough that you could feel air moving through the gap, the wooden beam overhead that groaned under specific weight distribution in a pattern that told you when patrols were passing on the level above. He had been Rome's weapon for 6 years, purchased from a Germanic border market after his tribe fell to the legions, trained at the ludus until his body became a vocabulary of efficient violence, and he'd earned the name Ferrum, the Iron, because spectators claimed he showed no more emotion during a kill than a blade shows when it cuts. But what the crowds never saw was what happened in the hours between fights, when he was ordered to help clear the Hypogeum, the subterranean maze where condemned prisoners waited for execution, and where the machinery of spectacle, the lifts, the animal cages, the trapdoors that opened onto the sand, required constant maintenance by people who understood the arena not as entertainment, but as architecture, as a designed system of stone and iron and wood that had been engineered to transform human bodies into public lessons about the cost of defying empire. It was during one of these clearing operations, moving a group of Christians toward their scheduled execution by beasts, that Marcus saw something that would make him choose a different kind of blade work than the one Rome had trained him for. A section of wall in an abandoned storage chamber where the dressed stone didn't quite match the foundation blocks, where someone generations earlier had built a false facing that concealed a narrow void. A space perhaps 2 feet wide that ran vertically through the structure for reasons lost to time. Perhaps a builder's error, perhaps an intentional ventilation shaft that later plans had rendered obsolete. And in that moment of seeing, Marcus understood that the Colosseum was not solid the way it appeared, but was actually hollow in places, contained spaces within spaces, and that these hidden geometries might be transformed from architectural accidents into something that would allow people to disappear, not by leaving Rome, but by remaining inside it, hidden within the very walls designed to display their deaths. Before we continue, remember to subscribe to Sand, Blood and Chains, where the stories that history feared finally speak again. The order came from the Lanista 3 days after that discovery, delivered with the casual authority of men who never questioned whether their commands would be obeyed. Marcus was to assist in the post-games cleanup, which meant ensuring the tunnels were cleared of any prisoners who'd survived their scheduled executions through luck or oversight, dragging bodies to the disposal pits, checking that all the mechanisms were reset for the next day's spectacles, and most importantly, making certain that no condemned person remained alive in the Hypogeum, where they might be discovered by maintenance crews or, worse, might find their way into the service corridors and potentially escape through one of the utility access points that connected the arena to Rome's broader infrastructure. The work was considered beneath most gladiators, assigned usually to the newest slaves or to fighters who'd lost favor. But Marcus had volunteered for it repeatedly, had made himself useful in ways that the Lanista appreciated because it meant one fewer problem to manage, and this pattern of volunteering had given him something more valuable than arena glory, which was intimate knowledge of the Hypogeum's layout, the map that existed in his memory like a language only he could read fluently. He knew which chambers flooded during heavy rains and which stayed dry, which wooden supports were rotting and would give way under weight, which iron grates covered shafts that descended to the ancient sewers and which were merely decorative elements that covered solid stone. And most crucially, he knew the maintenance schedules, when engineers would be working on the elaborate system of counterweights and pulleys that powered the arena's mechanical transformations, when guards would be distracted by shift changes, when the tunnels would be as empty as they ever became in a structure that never truly slept. He had been afraid in the beginning, afraid in a way that had nothing to do with combat, because at least in combat you could see your opponent, and the danger had shape and intention. But this fear was different. Was the vertigo of realizing that he possessed knowledge that could either save lives or end his own, that the void behind the false wall was both opportunity and trap. And he spent weeks simply observing before taking any action, watching how patrols moved, counting the minutes between inspections, noting which prisoners were scheduled for which executions, and whether anyone actually verified that the condemned had died on schedule, or whether the system simply assumed death, because that was what was supposed to happen. The Colosseum processed so many bodies that individual accounting was difficult, and Marcus began to understand that this administrative chaos was itself a kind of opportunity, that if someone disappeared from the holding cells, it might be recorded as early execution, or death from illness, or simply as a counting error, especially if the disappearance happened during one of the chaotic multi-day spectacles when hundreds of condemned were being moved through the tunnels simultaneously, and the guards were too exhausted to maintain careful records of who had been in which cell at which time. The first person he saved was a woman named Julia, condemned for Christianity and scheduled for exposure to lions, and Marcus had seen her praying in her cell with the kind of quiet certainty that came from believing death was transition rather than ending, and something about that certainty had offended him, not because he doubted her faith, but because it made him confront his own lack of certainty about anything except the weight of a sword and the direction of exit corridors. He waited until the night before her scheduled execution, until the third watch, when the guards were drowsy and the oil lamps had burned low enough that shadows became countries you could hide in, and he opened her cell using a key he'd stolen from a drunken overseer months earlier, and he led her through passages that required crawling, through chambers where animal stench was so thick it became texture in the air, until they reached the storage room with the false wall, and he showed her the void he'd discovered, the narrow, vertical space that climbed through the structure's interior. And he'd spent the previous week preparing this space by removing loose stones from inside the shaft to create small ledges where a person could brace themselves, by leaving strips of leather that could serve as handholds, by ensuring there was a route up to a ventilation grate that opened onto a forgotten terrace where maintenance crews stored tools and which had access to an external stairway that led down to street level. And he told Julia to climb, to move slowly so that the stones wouldn't shift and create noise, and to wait at the top until she heard the bells that marked dawn, because during that hour the terrace would be empty, and she could descend the external stairs and lose herself in Rome's morning crowds before anyone realized a prisoner was missing. She climbed, and Marcus stood at the base of the shaft, listening to the sound of her breathing echo down the stone throat, listening to the small scratches of her hands finding purchase, and when he finally heard nothing, he sealed the false wall back into place using mortar he'd mixed from crushed brick and water stolen from the beast handler's supply, and he returned to his cell and lay awake until dawn, wondering if he'd saved her or simply killed her in a more complicated way. And it wasn't until 3 days later, when he heard guards discussing the mystery of a Christian woman who'd vanished from her cell without any record of execution, that he knew she'd made it, had dissolved into the great anonymous mass of Rome's poor, where one more woman with no documents and no family connections was invisible by virtue of being unremarkable. After that, Marcus began seeing the Colosseum differently, not as a building, but as an organism with veins and chambers and hidden spaces that could be repurposed if you understood the anatomy well enough. And he started mapping these spaces during his maintenance shifts, using charcoal stolen from the furnaces to mark routes on strips of leather that he kept hidden in the lining of his sandals, creating a visual language of symbols that indicated which passages connected to which chambers, where counterweights could be manipulated to open unexpected doors, where grates could be removed if you knew that the bolts were decorative, and the actual attachment was a friction fit that would yield to steady upward pressure, where walls had hollow sections that a desperate person could squeeze into if they didn't mind spending hours in darkness, barely wider than their shoulders. The mapping was dangerous, not just because it required moving through areas that were supposed to be secure, but because it required a kind of attention that could itself be noticed. The way you'd pause at a wall and run your hands along the stones, testing for resonance that indicated hollow space. The way you'd study the iron fittings and determine which were structural and which were merely aesthetic and therefore removable. The way you'd observe the play of air currents and trace them to their sources in ventilation systems that the arena's architects had designed to clear smoke from the animal chambers, but which also connected to the city's broader network of air shafts and maintenance tunnels. The mechanical systems fascinated him most. The elaborate arrangement of counterweights and pulleys that allowed stage machinery to function, platforms that could rise from the hypogeum-bearing scenery or animals, trapdoors that opened to swallow defeated fighters, rotating walls that transformed the arena's appearance between spectacles. And Marcus realized that these systems were designed with enough redundancy and safety margin that they could be manipulated in ways their creators hadn't intended, that a counterweight meant to lift a platform could also hold open a door if you attached it differently, that a pulley system designed to raise a cage could be reversed to lower a person into shafts that descended below the official floor level into older structures that Rome had built over, rather than excavated, Republican-era foundations and cisterns that still existed as archaeological shadows beneath the empire's confident geometry. He began practicing with these systems during hours when maintenance was scheduled, but before engineers arrived, teaching himself how much weight would trigger which mechanisms, how to set a counterweight so that it would release on a delay, giving him time to move away before the noise attracted attention, how to use the natural sounds of the arena, the constant background hum of voices from above during games, the periodic roar when something dramatic happened in the sand, to mask the sounds of mechanical operation that would otherwise be suspicious during off hours. The work required not just knowledge, but performance. The ability to appear as though he was simply conducting routine inspections, when in fact he was constructing an invisible architecture of escape. And Marcus developed habits that made his presence in unusual locations seem unremarkable. He would carry tools or empty cages as though transporting them somewhere, would time his movements to coincide with actual maintenance schedules, so that if questioned, he could claim to be assisting engineers, would cultivate relationships with guards by offering to take over boring watches or to handle unpleasant tasks like cleaning beast chambers, gradually making himself so useful and so ubiquitous that his presence anywhere in the hypogeum became normalized, became part of the background texture of daily operation that people stopped consciously noticing. This normalization was itself a form of camouflage more effective than stealth, because stealth suggests you're hiding, whereas normalization suggests there's nothing to hide. And Marcus understood from his arena training that the most dangerous attacks weren't the obvious ones, but the strikes that came from angles your opponent didn't think to guard, because those angles seemed too mundane to be threatening. But mundanity offered only partial protection, and the first serious threat to his work came from a centurion named Gaius Severus, who'd been assigned to the Colosseum as part of some administrative reassignment, and who brought with him the paranoid attention to detail that characterized military men whose advancement depended on finding problems that civilians had overlooked. Severus began conducting surprise inspections of the hippodrome, comparing actual conditions to architectural plans, noting discrepancies like missing grates or moved equipment or sections of wall where the mortar looked newer than surrounding material, and he instituted new protocols that required signing logs whenever anyone accessed certain areas. Protocols designed to create paper trails that would reveal patterns if someone was spending unusual amounts of time in particular locations. Marcus adapted by fragmenting his work, spending a few minutes in one area, then moving to somewhere else entirely, never establishing a pattern that logs would reveal. And he recruited unwitting assistants by asking guards to check on things in locations where he needed access, giving him plausible reasons to be present without generating log entries in his own name. But these adaptations were tactical responses to a strategic problem, which was that Severus represented a kind of scrutiny that the arena hadn't previously enforced. And the longer this scrutiny continued, the more likely it became that Marcus would make a mistake small enough that he wouldn't notice it, but significant enough that Severus would. The crisis came during a week of imperial games, celebrating military victories, when the Colosseum was operating at maximum capacity and the tunnels were crowded with prisoners, animals, stage crew, everyone moving in orchestrated chaos that made the Hypogeum feel less like architecture and more like a living thing in the process of digesting sacrifice. And Marcus was helping move a group of condemned rebels toward their execution when he saw among them a boy, couldn't have been more than 13, who'd apparently been included on the death list because his father had been important enough to be dangerous, and Roman justice sometimes worked by erasing entire family lines to prevent future rebellion. The boy wasn't crying, wasn't even particularly afraid, just looked resigned in the way children learn to look when adults have made it clear that there are no good options. And Marcus felt something snap inside him, some restraint that had kept his rule-breaking measured and careful, because he'd made a private commitment to himself that whatever else he did or didn't do, he would not watch children die if there was any possible alternative. And the sight of this boy being herded toward the beasts made Marcus decide to take a risk that was larger and more visible than anything he'd attempted before. If you're still here, stay until the end. The truth hidden in the final moments will change everything you believe about this chapter of history. The execution was scheduled for midday, when the crowd would be largest and most enthusiastic, which meant Marcus had perhaps 4 hours to make something impossible happen in an environment where Severus had guards stationed at every major junction and had implemented new counting protocols that were supposed to prevent exactly the kind of disappearance Marcus was planning. He couldn't use the wall void because there were too many prisoners to move through there without creating bottlenecks that would be discovered, and he couldn't use the straightforward maintenance exits because those were being logged and monitored, so he needed to create chaos, needed to make something happen that would force Severus to redeploy his guards and create gaps in the surveillance that Marcus could exploit for the few minutes necessary to move people from their holding cells to hiding places that weren't on anyone's maps. The arena's machinery gave him the tool he needed. The central elevator system that lifted scenery to the arena floor operated on massive counterweights, and if those counterweights were released suddenly instead of in the controlled descent they were designed for, the resulting crash would sound like structural failure, would bring every engineer and guard running to assess damage, and during that convergence the peripheral areas would be briefly unguarded, briefly accessible. Marcus waited until the games had started, until the crowd noise was a constant roar that would mask mechanical sounds, and he moved to the central shaft where the counterweights were housed, and using tools he'd stolen and hidden, weeks earlier he released the primary brake, released all the safeties that were designed to prevent exactly this kind of failure, and the sound when the system collapsed was spectacular, was thunder inside stone, tons of iron and wood dropping 40 feet and slamming into the basement level with impact that shook dust from every ceiling in the hippodrome. And immediately Marcus heard the alarm bells and the shouting as guards and engineers converged on the disaster. And he used those minutes to move through the holding cells, opening them with keys he'd accumulated through theft and bribery, gesturing for prisoners to follow without explaining because there wasn't time for explanation, and anyone scheduled for execution understood, without needing words, that this was their only chance. He led them through corridors that were briefly empty, because everyone had responded to the crash, led them to a grate he'd loosened months earlier that covered a shaft descending to an old cistern that Rome had built and then forgotten when newer aqueducts made it obsolete, and he dropped a rope into that shaft and sent them down one by one into darkness that smelled of standing water and ancient stone, and he told them to follow the water flow east until they found daylight. And most importantly, he told them not to surface until nightfall, because emerging during day would make them visible to patrols, but emerging at night into the neighborhood near the Circus Maximus, where thousands of poor lived in anonymous density, would make them just more anonymous bodies in a city that held 1 million people, most of whom had no documentation and no fixed address. 23 people went down that rope, including the boy who was last and who looked at Marcus with an expression that wasn't gratitude, because gratitude implies choice, and the child understood this was simply exchange of one gamble for another. And when the last person disappeared into the shaft, Marcus pulled up the rope and sealed the grate and began the work of obscuring the evidence, which meant creating false trails that would suggest the prisoners had escaped during the confusion caused by the elevator collapse, rather than admitting that someone had deliberately caused the collapse to create the confusion. He moved through the tunnels, leaving open doors that suggested panicked flight toward exits that didn't actually lead anywhere useful. And he scattered personal items stolen from the cells in patterns that implied the prisoners had separated and fled in different directions. And most importantly, he made himself visible, helping with the elevator recovery so that guards would remember seeing him engaged in exactly what he was supposed to be doing, creating an alibi built from witness memory rather than documentation. Because documentation could be checked, but memory was flexible enough that people would convince themselves they'd seen him earlier than they actually had, if the official story required him to have been somewhere at a specific time. But Gaius Severus was not a man who accepted official stories that didn't match physical evidence. And within hours of the escape, he began asking questions that revealed his suspicion that the elevator collapse had been sabotage rather than mechanical failure, and he started tracing movements backward, interviewing guards about who had been where when the crash occurred, comparing their accounts to determine who might have had both access to the counterweight system and motive to destroy it. And the investigation was methodical in the way military investigations were methodical, building case through accumulation of small details that individually meant nothing but together formed pattern. And Marcus knew he was being observed, could feel Severus's attention like weight pressing on his back whenever they were in the same corridor, and he understood that the centurion was waiting for him to make a mistake, to do something that would confirm suspicion with evidence solid enough to bring before the ludus administrators who would demand explanation for how a gladiator had managed to subvert the arena's security so thoroughly. The confrontation came not through accusation, but through trap. Severus announced new security protocols that required all gladiators to report their locations every 2 hours, a system designed to make unauthorized movement impossible, and he specifically assigned Marcus to a rotation that kept him in the barracks during all hours when the hypodrome was accessible, effectively imprisoning him in a schedule that looked like duty roster but functioned as house arrest, and Marcus understood immediately that this was test, That Severus was seeing whether he would obey this restriction or whether his need to continue the rescue work was stronger than his instinct for self-preservation, and if he violated the schedule, Severus would have the evidence needed to arrest him. But if he obeyed the schedule, he would be abandoning everyone in the holding cells to their scheduled deaths. And there were 43 people currently condemned, including 7 children, who would be executed in various ways over the next week if no one intervened. Marcus made the decision that he'd known from the beginning he might have to make, which was to be visible one final time, in a way that would allow others to remain invisible permanently, and he violated the schedule, left the barracks during a restricted hour, and moved through the hypogeum toward the holding cells, and he did it knowing that Severus had certainly posted observers who would track him. But he did it anyway because the alternative was living with the knowledge that he'd chosen his own safety over children's lives, and he found that he couldn't make that choice and remain someone he recognized when he looked at his reflection in the water barrels. And so he moved through the tunnels, opening cells and guiding people toward the exits he'd prepared. The wall voids and shaft descents and postern doors that he'd spent months making functional, and he got 38 of them out, got them hidden in the city or descended into the sewers or dissolved into the crowds at the markets. But when he returned for the last group, Severus was waiting with guards, was standing in the corridor with arms crossed, looking at Marcus with the expression of someone who'd predicted exactly this outcome and was satisfied to have been proven correct. They didn't execute him immediately, because executions of gladiators required bureaucracy and approvals from the ludus owners who had financial investment in their fighters. And so they locked him in an isolation cell while the investigation proceeded, while Severus documented the evidence of sabotage and escape facilitation, and Marcus spent those days alone with stone walls and his own thoughts. And he realized that he wasn't afraid, not of the death that was certainly coming, but of the possibility that his work would be erased, that Severus would discover all the routes and seal them and make the Colosseum truly escape-proof, would take the architecture that Marcus had transformed from cage into labyrinth and transform it back into simple cage. And that fear was worse than any fear he'd felt in the arena, because it implied that everything he'd done had been temporary, had been possible only because of his specific knowledge, and would end when he ended, leaving no trace except administrative reports about security failures that had been corrected. But architecture outlives intention, and Marcus had understood from the beginning that the routes he was creating needed to be documented somehow, needed to exist in a form that could survive his death and be discovered by someone else who had both the need and the courage to use them. And during his months of mapping, he'd been creating a physical record, not on perishable parchment, but on the stone itself, scratching symbols into the walls, in places where casual inspection wouldn't notice them, but where someone looking carefully, someone who understood that marks might be language rather than random damage, would find a map written in the grammar of survival, arrows and dots and X marks that indicated which walls were hollow, which grates were removable, which counterweights could be manipulated, which shafts descended to older structures that connected to Rome's subterranean network. And he'd placed these marks deliberately in areas where prisoners would be held, where condemned people waiting for execution might spend their final hours running their hands along stone, and finding these scratches and understanding suddenly that the wall was not solid, was not final, was not the ending it appeared to be. They killed him in the arena 3 weeks after his arrest, gave him a sword and armor, and matched him against 6 men in what everyone understood was execution disguised as entertainment. And Marcus fought because his body didn't know how to not fight, because 6 years of training had made combat reflex rather than choice. And he killed 4 of them before the remaining 2 brought him down, which was 4 more than anyone expected from a man who'd been starved in isolation and had injuries from interrogations that made it painful to breathe deeply. And the last thing he saw before consciousness failed was the sky above the Colosseum. That perfect circle of blue that every fighter learned to focus on when the pain became overwhelming. And he thought about walls, about the hollow spaces he'd created and marked, about the language he'd scratched into stone that would remain after he was ash. And he thought that maybe this was what immortality actually meant, not being remembered, but leaving behind the possibility of escape, leaving roots that others could walk long after the person who made them had dissolved into history, and the crowd's roar faded into a sound like wind through empty corridors, like breath moving through stone lungs, like the whisper of someone who'd been condemned finding the marks and understanding what they meant and beginning to climb. Years later, during renovations to expand the Colosseum's capacity, stonemasons found anomalies in the structure that didn't match architectural records. Places where walls appeared solid but were actually hollow, where grates covered shafts that official plans claimed didn't exist, where mortar was newer than surrounding material, suggesting that someone had repeatedly opened and resealed sections of wall. And in several locations, they found scratches in the stone, symbols that might have been random damage or might have been language, depending on whether you looked at them individually or as patterns. And one young mason who'd grown up hearing stories about prisoners who'd mysteriously escaped from the Colosseum spent an afternoon tracing these marks and began to recognize that they formed roots, that they told a story in the visual grammar of connection and direction, that they were essentially a map showing how to move through the structure in ways that guards wouldn't expect. And he mentioned this to his foreman, who told him to stop wasting time on conspiracy theories and focus on actual work. And so the marks remained, were plastered over during the renovations, were sealed inside the walls they'd been created to make permeable, but their existence proved that someone had understood architecture as possibility rather than constraint, had seen in Rome's own walls the material for Rome's own defiance. And although the person's name didn't survive in any record and his life ended in public execution, that was probably recorded in some administrator's ledger as Gladiator, sabotage, executed, the work survived as rumor and possibility, and the knowledge that even in structures designed to be inescapable, there existed someone who'd spent their final months making them penetrable, making them hollow, making them into something that could be walked through rather than died against, and that someone had chosen to be shield rather than sword, had chosen to make their body the barrier that allowed others to pass through the places where Rome claimed there was no passage, and had succeeded not because they were remembered, but because the people they saved lived, had children, told quiet stories about the week they were supposed to die, but didn't, and these stories accumulated into a counter-history that existed in the margins of official accounts, existed in the silence between what Rome recorded and what actually happened in the tunnels beneath the roar of crowds who never knew they were sitting above geography that someone had transformed from death into life, from ending into beginning, from wall into door. If this story moved you, subscribe to Sand, Blood and Chains. Here, the forgotten truths of the ancient world live again, no matter how hard history tried to erase them.